Interested in this conversation. Re- Thank you, Jeannie. I'm really interested in this conversation this evening. Um, the idea of invasive plants or non-native plants that appear in ecosystems that have sometimes deleterious impacts is something that, as a park manager, we deal with and engage with on a regular basis. Is one of the reasons why we have partners like Rock Creek Conservancy to help us in managing this. But um, while the National Park Service didn't have a position on the naming or the types of names or language used around these plants or around this ecosystem management, we do recognize that language has power and that the choices in language do have power and can either include or exclude people from using or wanting to engage with something that, if you say, I would like you to come help me with some gardening, that's one thing. It's another thing to say, if we want, I need you to help me eradicate my minute and get rid of all these weeds, nasty weeds in this area. That has a different impact on people as we are talking with them and as we're trying to engage them. So, understanding the power of words and the power of how they impact depending on who you're talking to and their cultural and ethnic experiences is a worthwhile endeavor. And I applaud our panelists for wanting to undertake this and really kind of speak to this because it is the sort of thing that might lead people to think that we're being a little bit squishy and soft and, overly, overly sensitive. But again, if we're accidentally turning people off who might be actually interested in the work that we're doing and engaging with us because of the choice of a word or a phrase, isn't it worth considering that? And isn't it worth hearing what we can do to possibly be more intentional with our language? So thank you all very much. Like I said, I'm really excited to engage in this conversation and hear our speakers go through this discussion, and I'll turn it back to Jeannie.
Thanks so much, Brian. I'm just going to pass off to Alex and let's get this conversation started.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Viznica, and I'll moderate today's session. In my day job, I'm an invasive plant practitioner and a program manager for the National Park Service National Capital Region Invasive Plant Management Team. And as Jeannie has said, I'm also the member of a National Capital PRISM, or Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. And we are a group of organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, whose really goal is to slow the spread of invasive species and really share our knowledge with the greater and broader public and the communities here around DC. And today we are joined by two panelists, Dr. Katrina Majuli and Angela Gupta. And Dr. Katrina Majuli is Assistant Teaching Professor of Environmental Humanities at Northern Arizona University. Her research focuses on the ethical and relational dimensions of biodiversity, conservation and policy, practice, education, and media representation. Her work has appeared in Environmental Education Research and Routledge Handbook of Eco-Media Studies. And prior to her academic career, Dr. Majuli has worked in environmental education and program management for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and environmental nonprofits in Oregon. And Angela Gupta is a University of Minnesota Extension Professor of Forestry who specializes in terrestrial invasive species. She's done invasive species early detection, education, and outreach, including participatory science from crowdsourcing to community science since about 2008. Angie has been a key leader of the University of Minnesota Extension's Invasive Species Community of Practice since its inception in 2016. And this group has initiated improved common names for 22 non-native species. Angie co-created the Empower You course to engage decision makers about invasive species, and she earned her Master's of Arts in Organizational Management from Spring Arbor University and a Bachelor of Science in Forestry from the University of Kentucky. And prior to joining Extension, Angie was an industrial forester working with private landowners in Michigan and a U.S. Peace Corps agroforester extensionist in Kenya, East Africa. And before we get started with questions for our panelists, I would like to set the stage for today's event and add to what Brian already had said. Today, we'll be discussing the topic invasive rhetoric and the power of language. You may have heard the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. However, as much as we would like to believe this, words can have powerful impact. They can either unite or divide, inspire or belittle. And while we may not always express ourselves perfectly, it is important to be mindful of how our words may impact others. During this event, we'll be discussing a variety of topics, some of which may be familiar to you and some that may be new. And while you may not always agree with everything that's being said, we ask that you remain open, listen, and reflect on what you hear. Rock Creek Conservancy and Rock Creek Park have created a safe space for everyone to learn from one another. And we encourage you to participate in the chat and ask questions. There's no right or wrong question, and we'll do our best to answer all of your questions during this event. And I think with no further ado, let's jump into some questions. And for our panelists, if you feel like you want to add something else, just go ahead and jump in right after. Does that sound good? All right, so we have some starter questions for our panelists, but please add your questions to the chat as well, and we'll be pulling them together and asking our panelists. So my first question is, there are many common species with place-based names to be from Asia, such as Japanese honeysuckle, which is very common in our area, and Chinese wisteria. Based on your experience or discussion with others, how have place-based names impacted communities or individuals from or descendants from areas like Asia? And whoever wish, go ahead and jump in.
I'm happy to jump first. So we did a little planning, and this I have a few slides that maybe get to some of this. So if it's all right, I'll just start with those. And so the question was, why are there so many species named with Asian place names? And I think the answer is because we do have a lot of invasive plants that come from Asia. The way in which they get named, though, is maybe worth further reflection. So Asian longhorn beetle, for example, is actually, if you translate the Chinese, it's starry night beetle in Chinese. So that was just brought over. And let's just be clear, there's more than one longhorn beetle from Asia. So it's a bad name, right? But it's common that we see names like this, and they're not very good. So I think I only have 5 slides. I'll really quickly go through them and talk about how my group, the Invasive Species Community and Practice at the University of Minnesota Extension, kind of got to where we got. And so we have adopted a framework for inclusive common names for invasive species, and we've been working to slowly over time improve the common names that we work with in our space. And it really started because the Minnesota legislature in 2014 passed legislation about this very issue. So there was it's actually a suite of species, Asian carp, that was the name that was being used at the time. And a group of Asian Minnesotans came before the legislature and said, this name is causing us harm and we think you should not use it. And so the state legislature mandated that state agencies, so for us, this is really the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, have to use the name invasive carp. Turns out it's not really a lot better. It gets rid of the Asian and the problematic name, but invasive isn't really helpful. And it's still a suite of species and not one. So there are better things to call that, like bighead carp. But my point, there is a state statute. So clearly Minnesotans have been negatively impacted by names like this. And we thought it was our responsibility to pay attention and to sort of not require the legislature to step in when it comes to our names. We could do this better. So the position I found myself in at the University of Minnesota is I commonly am the first point of contact for a new to Minnesota non-native species that may or may not become invasive. And so I may literally be the first person to put together a website for Minnesotans about a new species to town. And so what I call it can have a lot of impact. And of course, we often default to the most common name or the name used by USDA plants or by EdMaps, a reporting app that we use, or by Minnesota Wildflowers, or there's lots of places in which we could go, but we really wanted to think more critically about that, knowing that this term Asian has caused problems for Minnesotans, and so we wanted to be on the front end of that change. So this is a really condensed version of a process, but we ended up first we really try to target species that are new to Minnesota. That's kind of our sweet spot, but we have taken on some from bigger ones. You guys might know the species Oriental bittersweet. We now call that roundleaf bittersweet and are strongly recommending everyone else do, but that's fully been accepted into state law here in Minnesota. That's an example of a species that was already heavily in regulation and was well known when we made the change. But then when we were trying to figure out what we were doing, we ended up having a really difficult conversation with our Extension Foreign Born Affinity group. So those are a bunch of University of Minnesota Extension colleagues of mine, so professionals within the university who were not born in the United States. And they were very negatively impacted by these names. And again, they are not necessarily an invasive species at all. They could be in youth development or they could be in civic engagement. But it turns out that they really did have a lot of what I would say baggage around these names. And so when we asked them for their professional feedback, we got it. And they were very clear and they challenged us in a way that is uncommon in Minnesota, the land of everyone is nice, that we would make change and we would be the leader of change in this space. And so we had to do a lot of deep reflecting about what is our sphere of influence, how much leadership can we take in this space. We're just one little community of practice inside of one little organization, inside of a fairly large institution in one state in a big nation, right? But we did it. We decided we were going to try. So then a bunch of complicated processes that took over a year, but ultimately we created a series of guiding principles to help us to do this thing, to make these name changes and to make the world better, one name at a time in a process. We're not saying it's the best, it's the only, but this is our effort to grow. And then we continue to do this over time and we keep trying to improve new names. We'll be working on 2 or 3 more this year. So that's where we kind of started. This is just one slide that kind of summarizes what our principles are. So if we want to get rid of a prefix of Asian, what might we do? So we consider the scientific name, is that reasonable? Many scientific names have people in them. Some of them, Japonica, they have place names in them. They don't necessarily solve the problem. A lot of people think that scientific names don't change. That is incorrect. A lot of species with genetics are now getting changed a lot. So I'm not sure they're any more stable than common names. They're often a bit more complicated for people to sort of remember and retain, but we do consider them seriously. Then we work to avoid place-based names, derogatory terms, common names that could be confused with other species or cultivars. That has tripped us up before, but we really work hard. So we do sort of a robust, not really a literature review, but review of names out in the world, and that can be from anywhere, like, is it Google, is it in catalogs, what's the scientific literature, all of those places. And then we have a series of feedback loops to make sure that we're not missing colloquial names or things like that. Then we evaluate the common names that are already present, and are there any that are good? Like, can we just pick another one, right? Sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't, but we really do try to do a robust search so we don't have to recreate the wheel or do unnecessary work. And then finally, when it comes to creating new names, which we've done a lot of, we encourage names that give information about the invasive species, the host, identification species, or characteristic symptoms. So something that can really help. So that example of roundleaf bittersweet, if you're familiar with American bittersweet, it's actually hard to find a lot of great differences, but it is a little bit rounder. So we kind of leaned into that. So that's how we landed there. But the same thing happens over and over again. So I won't go into this. Our group has led the change of 19 species and been pretty integral in 22. But you can see over here, 12 of these were jumping worms. We started just really wanting to rename Asian jumping worm. It actually has a bunch of bad names, so I won't repeat them all. And then it turns out that there were just many unnamed worms, period, both in their native range and here. And we thought, to get ahead of that, we're going to introduce to the world a bunch of names that we think are useful. But it was also really important to cross compare the different characteristics. Worms are a little tricky to identify on a good day. And so we wanted to sort of do that work up front. And so you can see, green worm, thin worms, green stick worm, curling worm. These are features of the worm to try to both make the name better and make identification easier. You can see we have a number of plants and then one clam. So we've been plugging along. And then, as I sort of alluded to, our sphere of influence is a bit limited, but we try. And so we have pretty good acceptance here in the state of Minnesota. Well, I think everyone has accepted our names, truthfully, all of the major players. And then we are certainly getting broader acceptance. So we're really excited about that. Happy to answer more questions if there's questions about those. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I feel like I gave a very robust answer, so I will stop talking for a while.
Katrina, is there anything else you would like to add to Angie's response?
Yeah, no, that was awesome, Angie, and covers a lot of the really important stuff. And things that I will add to that answer is I think there are dynamics too that go beyond even just like the names themselves that I think are super important. And I think that also even came up in some of our amazing audience's great responses to, I think this was the quiz questions, I think that everyone contributed to in the registration that are great dynamics for us to consider here as well, right? That has a lot to do with the framing around the names, right? There are certain names that, of course, we always have to get rid of that have to do with like names that have slurs in them very specifically, right? That are like incredibly problematic and that have caused a lot of problems in the past. There are the extremely imprecise components of names. But then are also the dynamics around what happens with the framing, right? And that's often what causes a lot of the harm, right? So the ways that we talk about the species are often what ends up causing a lot of the harm to people and communities, right? So so when we're talking about a lot of these non-native invasive species, right, coming from particular regions, right, we're often talking about them in negative ways, right? And talking about them as like being the enemy, right? As something that we need to like eradicate at all costs. And then that's what often ends up kind of like having those like highly negative kind of cascading effects on communities. And so I think like the efforts towards like renaming are like really important kind of efforts. I think they're really helpful efforts. But they won't, I think they need to be like paired, right? With like our further kinds of efforts around considering also the kind of framing of our communications about the kind of like non-native species as well, right? Because like if we do our kind of like renaming efforts, but then we also don't consider how are we talking about these species? How are we continuing to communicate them to the general public? If we're not changing how we're talking about them, then I think we're going to continue to still have problems around particularly like xenophobic kind of reactions, right? Which will, I think, still have those cascading effects. They might not necessarily be specifically connected to, say, a like Asian American community necessarily, because the species might not like have like Japanese attached to it anymore. So people might not have an immediate mental reaction to, let's say, like a particular group of like a community of like immigrants specifically, but you might still have a xenophobic reaction to all communities of immigrants, right? Which is often kind of the problem with a lot of our kind of like communication around non-native invasive species, right? Because we often have this like species sneaking over the borders, right? Sometimes that's our communication strategies, like are these species hitchhiking, right? And how are they moving across borders? And sometimes our communications often lean on things like political kind of dynamics, right? And kind of the idea of like political borders, right? Instead of talking specifically in the context of things like ecosystems, for instance. So thinking about those sorts of dynamics and what that means, right? As well as the names themselves, right? So thinking about the kind of like pairing, right, of those two strategies and maintaining that that kind of connectiveness is super important for us to kind of consider. So both those.
Awesome. And Katrina, you have looked for your research of this rhetoric around invasive species and compared it to tropes in horror films. Can you speak a little bit more about that and perhaps discuss some of your work about using comics and storytelling to really improve environmental ed and right giving it to student and turning it back to seeing what they come up to improve that language and that message?
Yeah, certainly. So, so some of my kind of like interest areas here are looking kind of like broadly at like what are some of the kind of like outreach and kind of educational strategies that I've seen kind of like over time in my own kind of background as an environmental educator. And a lot of the things that like I've been particularly concerned about have been things around like creating this rhetoric of like the good versus evil, right? Kind of like idea of like the good native species and the evil kind of like invading species, right? And often one of the kind of like strategies has been using sometimes like tropes from very familiar kind of genres, right? One of the reasons why like film genres are particularly successful is that we will recognize them instantaneously, right? You see a movie poster and you'll know it's a Western right away, you know it's a horror film right away because you recognize like, you know, characters from it. You'll recognize particular like moods, etc. And so horror film is one of the like kind of strategies, particularly monster movies from horror, right? Has been a strategy for kind of getting people more engaged around fighting the invading species, right? So you'll see things like the kudzu vine, like is, you know, climbing all over a house and it's gotten really big. Or like you'll see like the mitten crab is now like huge, grown to monstrous proportions, right? So, you know, they're dramatizing it, of course, making it much bigger. And it's, you know, to be kind of comical, right? But it's making these species like even bigger, kind of larger than life, right? To kind of like get the public engaged, right? We know this is how conservation work, you know, operates. We rely a lot on volunteers. I know many of the public here probably volunteers very specifically to help out with like invasive species removal. It's a huge, like hugely important base that we have to try and help out with that. But it becomes this kind of key strategy to get people kind of like, we need to fight back, right, against these like these villainous species. But there are harms that come with that, right? Because it particularly casts, right, these species in this like a moral role, right, as the villain, right? And what does that mean, right, for us? So we're thinking this kind of like in an ethical kind of framework here, right? These species aren't acting morally, right? Like they're just doing what they can to survive, right? And who kind of placed these species in these contexts, right? How did they get there, right? There's a lot of like extra questions that aren't necessarily always being like asked when we like educate in that way. And so there's a lot of like morality, right, that needs to be considered there. And when you kind of frame something in this very simplistic good versus evil narrative, you're also not doing justice to native species, right? You're framing them as very passive, right? They need to be rescued, right, from these evil invaders. And so I think there's not a lot of good work you're doing there. And so things that I've kind of considered as especially educational alternatives for youth education is thinking about things like could be like a comics creation education, particularly for students. And so part of this is thinking about using like narrative as a way for students to engage with thinking through what does like management actually look like in practice. It's a lot more complicated, right, than this kind of just very simplistic good versus evil, right? So engaging students in like thinking through those complicated ethical questions, right? Sometimes it is an ethical question when it comes to using things like herbicides, right? Those can have other kinds of cascading effects and harms. So asking those kinds of deep questions for students, having them like debate that with one another. And so having that kind of also iterative approach, right? Because management is iterative, right? We kind of return to our management plans. We ask new questions, right? We have to reevaluate. And so having students kind of go through that process together and continue asking those questions and build that kind of ethical, particularly environmental ethical questions, right, into our educational practice is so important because I think we often leave that out, right, of the work that we do when we're teaching about invasive species. We don't talk about environmental ethics, and I think we really should be doing that kind of labor as well.
Thank you. That's great.
Can I jump in with a slightly different response to that? So that was great. But I did some work a couple of years ago, starting during the pandemic, related to jumping rooms, an invasive species here in Minnesota. And kind of a long story made short, people kept crying on the phone with me. And as a forester, like, this was outside of my normal scope of duties, and I didn't really know what to do with that. So I was able to persuade a very lovely group of master naturalists to do a lit review on the emotional impacts of invasive species for me. Yeah, there's no literature on that. So we broadened our scope to include the emotional impacts of climate change. And then I found at least one article that had a tool that I was able to deploy to my jumping worm participants. And it turns out that these invasive species were causing a lot of forms of anxiety, and we could name them. And so then, as I learned more about climate anxiety and climate work, I've really been thinking about the way we frame invasive species. So when we have these huge monsters, is that also overwhelming our psyche to manage them, right? Because the truth of the matter is, they're often not huge, right? I mean, they can be. Kudzu can get quite large, so can roundleaf bittersweet. But if we make them out to be really huge and overwhelming, I worry that that has its own negative impacts on our anxiety levels, our ability to as humans be resilient in the face of change that we're experiencing, whether that's climate change or invasive species management. So I'm noodling more into that work and really trying to think about it more, but I'm really leaning into creating resilient ecosystems, as well as the resilient humans that steward those ecosystems. So I just want to throw that to universe, and I'll let Alex come back, reel us in again.
No, I think that is really important, and something that we're looking and thinking about National Park Service. How do we build a very resilient and inclusive work practices, right? There's a huge mission coming and push from our director, and every park is doing that too. So I think it's very important, right? For my own resiliency, so I can continue doing this work and I don't feel defeated. I look for these little victories throughout my day, because I think that's what really inspires me to continue. So I appreciate you looking into that and connecting climate change with this, because right, climate change is a huge amplifier to many stressors faced by our natural systems. You know, we kind of touched base about this, but we also tend to speak about invasives in very militaristic terms. And here in DC metropolitan area, and then I know there's other programs across the nations, we have a volunteer program called Weed Warriors. And these are our volunteers who really tackle the non-native invasive species. And they, in their one of the best resources to our parks, and we're some of the best stewards across the parks. But some people have expressed concerns about this term, while others find it enduring. So, you know, how can we talk more about this militaristic approach, and how can this be problematic but also beneficial, or maybe was used previously as a way to inspire the crowds?
I'm more than happy to to hop in here. Yeah, I've obviously thought a lot about this kind of like question of framing, and um, it's it is interesting to see like how people debate about this. And one of the kind of like things that interestingly come up about this is when people will say like, you know, whatever can get people on board, right? Which is of course what, you know, I immediately get concerned, right? When people will say that, right? Because like, what are we justifying, right? Especially when we're like getting back to what we've talked about at the very beginning, right? Is like, what are the cascading effects is always what I think about, right? Especially when we're thinking about this kind of militaristic metaphor, and who is this going to impact? So especially when we're thinking about these kind of like xenophobic kind of like language that's often surrounding invasive species, right? A lot of the kind of like language that we're like kind of like flippantly sort of using, right, is a lot of the same exact language that's being used as like anti-immigrant kind of rhetoric. And if we're talking about like going out and like, we need to engage everybody in a militant kind of way to like slaughter this like species, basically, right? How does that kind of language then fall back on, right, like immigrant communities in this country, right? I think that's extremely dangerous and scary, and so it frightens me, honestly. And so I think I think people don't always think about that kind of like what that actually can mean and how that can feel, right, for communities when they see like, okay, what is that language and how has that language been used like historically, right, against people, and continues to be used in the contemporary moment against like, human communities, right, in this country. So I think that's the kind of like dangerous part there, that needs to be like really considered carefully, right, about like how you want to use that language, and particularly because there's a way in which often like political borders will often be used in some of the outreach materials. And there's reasons why this is the case, even though like obviously political borders don't really mean anything ecologically, right? There's very, very few times in which like political borders will align with ecological borders for us, right? But it makes sense why political borders will like, casually end up in these materials because, right, we often will have like, you're working for like a state, like, fish and water, like, fish and wildlife organization, right? Or you're working for like a county-based organization. And so your outreach materials might say like, protect your county from like X species or whatever it might be. So you don't think about that like, right away. But then when you kind of think about the cascading effects of that, okay, what does it mean to talk about this in the context of a political border? That's going to have potential impacts, right, on communities when you start kind of like building that out. So I think there are unthought of consequences of this that can be potentially really dangerous, right, for human communities especially.
And I won't, I'll add a little bit, but it's sort of a little different. So I agree with all those things. And then sort of from the really pragmatic side is like, where do you begin, right? And so one of the things that I have learned from the invasive species community practice, which is not a very large group, is that it turns out our sphere of influence was much larger than we thought it was. So once we were willing to take on the issue and we had made the commitment as a group, like that was maybe the really big first hurdle to make the commitment as a group and then do it. But once we started to do it, it wasn't, there were some really long slogs that happened throughout the process, but like the actual getting people to change names has not been nearly as hard as one would think. And so in the chatter, there's talking about weed warriors and other names. And I just want to say, like, you may have more ability to do this than you have given yourself credit for. So, I think there's a benefit to trying and to seeing how it's going. And we have really framed this as a journey. There are many better ways to do things, and we're going to try them, and we're going to keep going, and we're going to continue to try to work on that journey. And we might get it wrong occasionally, and we hope we will try our best to live and learn and do better. And so that has been really helpful for us. Also, academics can kind of get bogged down in the details, and we got to keep going. So I just want to say there's hope if you decide to make change. And for what it's worth, we've really leaned into stewardship as a framing. And so that gets us away from the militaristic framing, but it also is a little bit more flexible, and it's iterative, and people can steward in many ways, and that can also be really helpful for enabling more people to participate in the ways that they are able and comfortable.
And the word steward to me gives a sense of ownership, right? We are all part of a system, right? These are working in public lands, county lands, right? It's our shared responsibility to manage these areas and protect them to the best of our ability.
Right, exactly. And it doesn't require ownership, because that is also a barrier. Like in forest land, we often talk about woodland owners, but there are plenty of woodland stewards out there who may never aspire to ownership, but yet their engagement in our natural resources is critical. And so, and then you can steward the environment from your own yard, right? By planting a native instead of a non-native, you've taken away the ability for it to become invasive, right? So that is a form of stewardship, even if you never leave your landscape. So anyway, that's how we've sort of leaned into it a little differently.
I want to pivot to I guess, to whose responsibility is it anyway to address these common names, right? The Entomological Society of America governs the insect common names, and we've seen this movement to spongy muff from previously used gypsy muff. But is there one organization or agency that can address common names for other taxa, right? Plant service, so many people and groups that are part of this community in the United States, abroad. Whose responsibility is it, and who can we reach out to, or who should be our leader in this?
Yeah, so I'll jump in here. So I would say, for better or for worse, it's not necessarily clear most of the time. So Entomological Society of America has fully claimed the right to do common names and to manage scientific names, and they just like own it, and they now have a process. And truthfully, I'm so delighted they're doing it, because then we don't have to tackle those. But many of them, plants, there's no unifying body. There's a couple others. I feel like there's a couple others, like fungus, that might have a unifying body, sort of obscure species. But the truth of the matter is, it's worth, we've done the research. I could pull up the document and tell you if there are groups that do it. Typically the groups other than Entomological Society of America are relatively obscure species, so they're not ones that we're really talking about kind of commonly. So plants, a big one. Aquatic invasive species, I don't think there's a regular governing body. Worms, there's definitely no governing body. So it is a little species dependent, but the long and short of it is, it's often a void. So I have been encouraging NIASMA, North American Invasive Species Management Association, to sort of take that on as a national coordinating body, and I don't think they've done it yet. So anyway, this is how a place like University of Minnesota can sort of step in and make some change. Again, we're really looking at those species that are important for our education and outreach, and so we are frankly not interested in taking on Florida species, right? But it does open up opportunities for other people to lean into that space where there are these voids, and there are some big ones. And then we're trying to get better about this, actually, but we really don't want to duplicate effort. So if someone else is working on a name, we will happily let them take the lead and offer feedback if that's useful. But there's no reason to duplicate effort and then have multiple organizations coming up with differing common names for the same species. Like, that's just a bigger mess than we already have. So I don't know if that was helpful, but it is not an easy answer.
Katrina, do you want to add to that? I think Angie covered it pretty well, but please feel free to add to it.
Yeah, nothing to add.
I think we touched a little bit about this, but the many scientific names also are place-based or honor people who, can I say, may have problematic history, right? For example, if a scientific name, and someone mentions in the chat as well, for vine honeysuckle or Japanese honeysuckle is Lonicera japonica. And right, and we said it has been done before, but what does this process look like, right? Like, who do we go to, right? It's not like I use itis.gov to look up the accepted scientific names for National Park Service, for example, or USDA plans, but I know that's not it. There's probably like a process governing maybe agency, organizations that would go through that process. And maybe that is a very large question about a simple answer.
So I can jump in there. We focus on common names. So the scientific names are more heavily regulated. Regulated is not quite the right term, but there are governing bodies who seem to claim ownership of scientific names, and we have not, frankly, worked to engage those bodies. So we have sort of just stepped away. So when we assess a species, we look at that, and if japonica is in the name, right, then we're like, okay, that's a poor choice to lean into for our common name. But we've really stuck with the common names because that is a wild west. There's so little consistency in common names that we really feel like we can make difference there, meaningful difference. And then the other thing is, for the education outreach that Extension does, we can just prioritize the common name and communication and just to some degree ignore a bad scientific name. I mean, some of us will know it, but it's not really solving the problem, but that does feel a little outside of our sphere of influence.
Yeah, it seems like the common names are kind of, that's what's actually going into the public sphere. So, you know, where it would make the most impact, at least on the general public, that seems like the area to do the most work at this stage, at least. You know, it'd be great to get all of that work done, but to focus your energies at least.
One of the questions from the chat is, does the term native or non-native is also problematic? Have you experienced working with these two terms?
I'm happy to jump first. I have a lot of opinions, actually. So we use a pretty clear definition of invasive. So, and it does include the term native in it, right? So non-native species that causes economic, ecological, or human health harm. But I think native, particularly as it relates to climate change and range expansion, is a word that needs to be defined. And I will tell you, I am not very keen on defining it based on political boundaries. And so that is where then I think it does matter. And so I am less certain I have firm opinions about like Virginia creeper or American sycamore, right? So those American place-based names in front of our indigenous species. Like, I'm unclear, like I don't have firm opinions on that. So, but this whole not defining native and then using that in our definition of invasive, I find to be a bit problematic. We spend a lot of time really also talking about weeds, which for us are not all invasive species are weeds, but not all weeds are invasive species because they can be aggressive natives. And so we do use the term aggressive natives, but I've been really challenging people here in Minnesota to think, are those the climate resilient species? Right? So like, be careful what you say, because it turns out their aggression may actually be a reflection of the fact that they're thriving in our current and may well thrive in our future climate. Whereas in northern Minnesota, some of our very beloved iconic northwood species are not likely to thrive in Minnesota. And we are likely to be really looking at them as refugia. And there's a whole psychological impact to that. So framing the resilient natives as weedy or, aggressive, I also find to be a bit concerning. So I'll be done. I'm not entirely sure I answered the question, but I've given a lot of thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree, everything Angie's saying here, right? I think these are really complicated terms, and so much of our terminology, I mean, as a humanities scholar too, like definitions are so important. And I think sometimes we also in the sciences, people start to forget about the fact that definitions are so deeply complicated. Even the definition of species, I could go all day talking about that, but we aren't going to do that right now. But yes, like especially we can start thinking about like there's particular like species that can wreak havoc in like a like fire adapted kind of like ecosystem that's not getting fire in that moment, right? So we have a lot of like questions around that. And especially I think there's a lot we can talk about, particularly regarding climate change right now, right? And the ways in which ranges are changing, right? For species. And this is I think there's a lot of our conversations around like native, non-native. How is this entire debate going to be altering moving forward? How is conservation like, and what management's going to look like moving forward? It's already what management is changed, right? What you can and can't do has changed, right? So I think what this is going to look like in the next 10 years is going to be different, unfortunately. This is just the world we're living in today. So I think there's just a lot of questions that aren't fully answered, and they're going to continue to change moving forward. So a lot to consider.
From the invasive species practitioner, right? we don't have enough resources to manage everything, so we have to be very intentional about what we're doing and why we're doing, and really our main goal from natural resources is protect these unique habitats that can support our plants and overtax it, right? We can, it's sometimes easy to be very species focused, but we have to think a little broader. And I think there's many ways where when we are very species focused, but we must think a little more than that. Beyond that, community base is very important as well. So maybe it seems like we need to strike a balance between communicating the urgency for taking action and while using language that doesn't alienate people, right? There's a cost associated with inaction. And how can we think about it? It's like, what, based on your work, whatever sphere of influence you may have, what seemed to really work for you? How do you balance that call for action, but also ability to bring people together rather than alienate them?
I can jump in maybe. So again, we started, and it was really that clear direction from the Foreign Board Affinity Group that we were going to be the facilitator of change. And I will tell you, that was like a hard message here. We were like, really? We had to do some deep reflecting on that. But then since we've really started and done this work over and over again, I think we've gotten pretty pragmatic about some things, right? So, if people tell us names that they think should be improved all the time, we put it on a list. And the rule is if we can get 3 to 5 people to review those names, then we'll do it. And if we can't, then it sits on the list until its day comes or its day doesn't come. And so we're not trying to force it, right? We're like, here's our capacity, here's what we can do, this is what we're willing to do. Sort of similarly, we've also sort of looked, once we became known in that space, it became a lot easier to recruit people to help us. So now, if any of my state agency partners, so Minnesota Department of Agriculture, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Minnesota Department of Transportation, other university staff, if they come to me and they can bring a name, and if they bring a couple people, we can do it together, right? But also, if they bring a name and there seems to be resistance, we'll just have a chat about that. Like, is this really not going to go anywhere? What are the barriers? Is this the time and place for that? And should we sit on it and percolate it and get the word out, and then reconsider that? And we've done that a couple times, and it has come back. Round leaf bittersweet was a good example, right? We're like, it's in statute. How easy is that to change? And it turns out it wasn't hard, but it took a little noodling. It took a little time before we really did it. And so we're trying to really build relationships and trust as we go in this communal process, as opposed to forcing things that people are less interested in. And that seems to be serving us well. It does mean, though, that at times we haven't sort of done the really brave thing, right? So for us, Japanese beetle is the #1 species people tell us they want changed. And we were like, whoa. Like, we just didn't feel like we could take it over. It turns out ESA wants it. Entomological Society of America is doing insects, and so yay, I don't have to do it. But we set on that one. We, before ESA really stepped into that space, I will say I've not been sad we set on it. But we didn't sort of take the bravest route forward because that felt like too much for us. And we just owned that. So I don't know if that helped, but that's how we've sort of managed it.
Yeah, I think also just regarding like kind of like the framing related question, kind of like the other sort of like aspect and dynamic of it. I think going into everything with just like as much thoughtfulness as possible, right? Pausing, thinking, right, about like everything you're kind of like putting out, right? Like, how are we talking about this? Like, are we truly talking about this in the context of like ecosystems, right? Or are we accidentally falling into like any like political border languages that we didn't realize we were doing? Those kinds of things I think are always important. And I think what I find really most interesting moving forward also is not undervaluing like what the native species are doing in response to these new species as well, right? Because I think, like we point out, right, there's a lot of questions and complexity around like we're doing our best, right? And we are trying to like remove a lot of these species that are like coming and causing like problems, right? And there's only so much we can do, right? We're really trying hard. And I think there's a lot of interest that I think we should pay attention to is like these species, like the native species that we have here, are not passive, right? They're responding in some way, right? What are they doing in response? How can we manage with those species, right? How can we support them moving forward? And I think that's like an interesting way to have that conversation and to talk to people about that, to educate with those species, to manage with those species. I think just having a conversation to talk like that rather than to say we're eradicating, right? Or we are like, I think just it's like a shift in your mind a little bit, I think. Like, I want to manage with these species, right? I want to align myself with these species. I'm trying to help them, support them moving into the future, right? Because I think there's ways in which our native species are they're trying to adapt, right? They're doing things, they're using some of these other species, right? And you can see the ways that they're doing that because, you know, some of these species we might not be able to get rid of entirely, right? And hate to say it, right? You know, and so I think it's interesting to just paying attention to that, what's happening moving forward and how is climate change going to change this too, right? So, you know, don't want to be a downer, right? But it's paying attention to those kind of like ecosystem shifts, right? And trying to like manage with the interests, obviously, of those species we're trying to support in mind, and paying attention to what they're doing, right, as well. I think is something to listen to and to pay attention to moving forward.
Absolutely. We do this work because we want to protect the ecosystem functions and that plant communities that are part of that system, right? It's often better way, at least for me from experience, to inspire young professionals, especially in our field, right? It's not about invasive plant removal. It's about what's going to benefit from us doing it. I think I saw one of these questions in the chat. Is there a data depository at like a place where we can go look up more appropriate common names, like a better common name project, or something else a lot of us deal with terrestrial plants, but there's obviously over taxa, but is there a good place where we can look up better common names?
So I will say that's some of the professional feedback we've heard over and over again is no, how can I do it better? And so so we have a journal article appending and we're trying to get our website, like it's awkward to know where to put it. There's all kinds of internal conversations, but that's just our little tiny suite of the world. So what I will say is my experience with EdMaps, if you guys use that I think they just go by EdMaps now, invasive species reporting app, free smartphone app, and there's a whole database. Are you guys familiar with EdMaps in the DC area? Yeah, okay. So I have found them to be very accepting of improved common names. And so if somebody has worked on it and suggested a change to EdMaps to make an improved name, I would strongly suspect that has been done. So when you find ones that don't look great, it's probably because nobody's tried or come up with a better alternative. That is not a great answer to your question, but that question is one of the most common questions we get. And we're trying to do our part, but I'll tell you, it's been a weirdly heavy lift.
I bet. Katrina, any other thoughts or resources you can think of?
That's Angie's area, so I will look into that too. I'm very interested to see the developments in that area.
Yeah, I know the developers of EdMaps have a few other apps in the works. One of them, I think it's called Wild Spotter. It's to really help improve the reporting of early detection, rapid response species, depending on where you're located. Jeannie, do you have any other questions from the chat? I am trying to follow the chat, but it's bouncing around, so maybe you could help me.
I will say the chat is a rich treasure trove of resources and ideas that I think we will refer back to for quite a long time. Thank you both, Katrina and Angie, for all this really incredible input. We actually got some questions also with people's registration, so I'm going to reference a few of those. We had one person who was interested in hearing about how this might apply if you're speaking to a community of people that are not native English speakers. For example, we have Spanish-speaking communities around Rock Creek Park. We've stumped the panel.
I can jump in there. So it's been a little bit interesting. So I suspect if they're local community members, then we haven't done any translated works. So we have done like no Spanish translation or Somali or Karen or Hmong. That would be the groups around here. But what I think what I found is they know from personal experience why this matters. So it's not about like explaining the issue to them so much. Interestingly, when we have tried to engage colleagues from the native range of these species to see like, is there a native name that would be appropriate and useful? They totally don't understand the issue. Like really can't get their brain around it. And I think one, they're maybe not a minority in their culture, so they come from a majority perspective. And I think maybe the good news is our ugly baggage about racism is not well known all over the world. And so they just don't even understand why we're asking the question. So it's been a little bit interesting. But at least for our groups, when we've talked about this, if they're essentially non-white, nobody has questioned why we're doing it. I think they're very clear about why it needs to happen.
Yeah, I guess like is the question like curious about like translating the materials or like translating the like the names themselves into like Spanish, or I guess
The question
was there
wasn't specific, so maybe yes.
okay. Yeah, I guess that's why I'm stumped. I was like, it's like which layer like are we interested in thinking about specifically here? Because obviously that is like that's just like a general, I guess, like issue that we always run into, right? With a lot of materials are often just like not translated, right? And so that always I think is like a important thing that we need to do more of, right? In most kind of areas of having like better translated kind of materials. So that's just kind of like, I guess, a flat line, right? Like that we need to do more of that kind of work. But I think that is like an interesting, like an important dynamic, right? Of thinking about that, as like Angie points out, right? Of what could some of those other kinds of names be, right? From other regions. But yeah, I guess like I'm kind of interested in what the other kind of like what's behind the question is what I kind of was curious about. But alas, more detail would help me answer like what's at the heart of the question.
Yeah, well, if the person who asked that question is here with us tonight, please feel free to add some clarification in the chat and we can try to get a better answer for you. Along those lines, I'm sorry, Dr. Chan wasn't able to join us this evening. Sam Chan from Oregon State University was meant to be our third panelist. And he mentioned that there is not a ton of research that has identified individuals who feel they've been harmed by these names. And I'm curious if either of you are aware of any efforts to document that impact.
I know there's like particular like scholars in the field that are like specifically like from like communities that are impacted that have like worked on this in particular. So like Vania Subramaniam is one that she does amazing work, and she very specifically talks about like her like the impact on herself and then working on this particular field. But I haven't done a lot of like on like particular like kind of like social science kind of like studies, like looking at like a really broad array of, there's a lot more of like looking at the kind of general kind of like framing more than kind of like interviews that I've necessarily specifically seen. But Angie might have another answer for that.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. So I've had a lot of people reach out to me about this work, and I don't want to overstate myself here, but I think I am the only person that, as a part of the invasive species community practice, reached out to a group that was immediately impacted by this early in our process. And so, and again, they were really clear how they felt about it. We had it was first an email exchange amongst colleagues, right? We all know each other. And then it ended up being one of the most stressful meetings of my career. And again, we're all colleagues, like we all work for the same institution, we're all great people, whatever, but it was really stressful and painful. But the question was about research, and I think the answer is no. And I want to, if you'll just sort of bear with me, I want to read you this quote, because we really did some reflection and took the clear not recommendations, they were challenges from the Foreign Born Affinity Group. We did a lot of soul searching, but I strongly believe that I don't want to have to speak for the people that are being impacted, right? I want them to be able to speak for themselves, but they are rarely at the tables in which I'm at. And that is concerning for me, right? So we kept inviting them to go to presentations and to do all these things. And over, they were kind of like, not my space, not my space. And so finally I wrote, like, do you want me to stop asking? Like, I have a little baggage about always sort of representing you, if that, well, that doesn't feel super great to me. And this is what she said. So if you'll bear with me, I'll read it, because I think it kind of gets to this a little bit. So this is from one of the leaders of the Foreign Born Affinity Group at the University of Minnesota. So she was born elsewhere, and she wrote this to me. And she's very engaged in DEI work. DEI work is by nature harrowing work, filled with pushback, ridicule, systematic barriers, heartaches, mistakes, hard lessons, etc. BIPOC people who've been engaged in DEI work understand that there is a greater cost to themselves than benefits or accolades when engaged in this work. But people still do it because it's just a necessary work. Courage, perseverance, grit, humility, positivity, and open to continuous learning are core ingredients of lifelong DEI work. I understand your emotional energy and worries about perceptions and who has the right to show up regarding DEI work. Give yourself some grace, keep moving forward, and continue to learn. And she was really clear. She does not have the capacity to sit in these spaces with me. And so, to be really frank, I think I'm not saying that social science didn't do this research, because absolutely we need the research. I suspect many of these audiences are pretty exhausted, and this isn't super high on their priority list. And so she told me, I thought in pretty clear terms, that she challenged me to do it. She's trusting us to do it, and it's our place to speak. But it is uncomfortable. So I don't know if that helped, but.
Thanks. And while we're talking about colleagues, we had a question about how you would or how you have engaged conservation professionals in this, either the discussion about it or the implementation. And I would say both of the common names, but also of the framing approaches. And I think the question was asked a little bit in the spirit of how do you get them to care. I do want to note that many of the natural resource managers and vegetation ecologists from our region are here with us tonight. So I think the do they care question might be a little different for this particular group, but still want to put that question out there.
Yeah, I am very encouraged now about how I mean, I know when I first kind of was thinking about these issues like a decade ago, I was very discouraged because I was really concerned and really disturbed, in fact, by the kind of educational material that was out there, the way outreach was, and things have very drastically changed, I feel like, in the past decade. And I feel like there's a lot more efforts people are making now about being really much more thoughtful. And when I was at least it was a few years ago in Oregon, there were groups of education, environmental educational professionals coming together and having workshops about how do we think differently about our educational strategies for invasive species, things like that. So there's a lot, I'm seeing a lot more efforts people are making and trying to think about how do we do this differently. And so I think that I think it's not hard, at least I feel like now, to get people to start having those conversations. I think it's at the surface more. People are realizing that there's something amiss, right? And we need to have that conversation now. And so I think it's easier to start those conversations. People are more ready for that. I think just the fact that all of you wanted to have us come have this conversation, which I think is so exciting. So I'm very encouraged by the energy that our people in the kind of conservation community more broadly around this. So I find that to be very exciting about that. So.
And I can second that. So we started this work before the pandemic, and there was a lot of like, I can't really see that, so it must not be a problem. And again, when people look like me and they interact, the world interacts with them like that, it turns out like we really might not understand the problem the same way someone who looks and is engaged with differently. And it was a hard sell. People were like, I don't get it. It's not worth it. You're just, yeah, whatever. They weren't very supportive, at least some. There was a minority, or there was a silent majority and then a vocal minority is probably what it was. Then COVID-19 happened. And when the president at the time used the word China virus and then human beings were physically attacked, it became very clear that those words mattered. And we saw almost an immediate shift in that conversation. And all of a sudden we were less sort of wonky liberals, which I'm never sure, I don't think that was ever accurate, right? To like, wow, maybe we really did have a point and maybe there is actually validity to that. And then I think, to be really frank, we've gotten to a point where it is more uncomfortable to be opposed to it, right? So to really stand up and say, this is not, I think this is bad, is a much more uncomfortable position to be in. And so people are quieter about it. Isn't necessarily persuading them, right? And so sometimes I think, there's a group of people that are going to be late adopters, and we know that, and they'll just adopt eventually when everyone else does, and hopefully that they'll eventually come with the crowd. And I'll take that as a win, right? If we can get our early adopters and our platforms to make change, and then we can get people to join us, then that's great. Entomological Society of America has like timelines that they expect things to be changed for their spongy moth campaign. We have no such clear aspirations. But I do think that there has been a very important change. And to Katrina's point, this feels much more comfortable and much safer, and it feels more hopeful. But that is actually like the question earlier, like, where can we find these? We were really resistant to post a bunch of things online early on because we were very worried about being plastered on a website or social media site and slandered. I mean, it was a deep concern. If you all remember the Saturday Night Live sketches. Anyway, we did not want to end up as a Saturday Night Live sketch. Just say that.
I mean, all press is good press, right?
No. I need to sleep at night.
Fair enough. Though when we do get invasives on Saturday Night Live, I do look forward to more awareness about the need. I want to give thanks. Someone in the chat mentioned the work that's been happening in the mini oases that Weed Warriors and Park and Conservancy folks have been working on in Rock Creek, where a lot of invasive plants have been removed. And we're actually starting to see a lot of the spring ephemerals come back. In one of those spots, we saw May apples where neighbors said they hadn't seen them in more than 10 years. So earlier, one of you was talking about the invasive anxiety, and I will say those small wins, that native seed bank that comes back does give me hope this time of year. So thank you to everybody who helps make that possible. We had some clarification from the tricky question. Sylvia said her interest was really around how do you frame the discussion about invasives, natives, non-natives when you're working with an immigrant community. So may or may not be in Spanish. Like, I think the fact of it being in Spanish is less important than the how do you communicate with an immigrant about these topics.
Yeah, totally. Okay, yeah, I see. different kind of approach. Yeah, so I mean, I think part of it, again, my interest there, the kind of framing approach, is to make sure we're not like thinking about this in a way to make people feel like uncomfortable, to make them feel ostracized in any way, right? Is again talking about this in like a much more like ecological kind of approach, right? When we're thinking about it that's why these like species are harmful like at all, right? And so I think that would be the primary kind of way I would want to talk about it to anybody, right? And as well, thinking about it, the communication to someone who's like an immigrant as well. That would be that kind of communication. So trying to make sure we're not like talking about these species as like, well, this is the species from like this region, right? Like be talking about like this species is harmful because it's not from like this particular ecosystem, et cetera, right? So I think like sometimes you don't even need to talk about like where that species is even from necessarily, right? To try and communicate why it's causing an issue, right? And in where it is now. That can be a useful kind of like entry point, right? So I think that can be one helpful kind of like framing for that.
So I admit to not having done a lot of this, but we have a lot of Hmong here, and they're very they do a lot of gathering in the woods. They're big users of forest resources. And so sometimes, I mean, I think it's important to remember that some of these species have useful, I mean, they were brought here for medicinal purposes, for edible purposes or whatnot. So we have communities that regularly go out and harvest invasive species as a form of food. And so we know that there are some research managers that intentionally leave little clumps for them, right? And I'm really hoping to hire some staff to really lean into this, to do community science work within the Hmong community. And so I hopefully will have more robust answers. But I do think it's important to remember that these species are behaving badly in this ecosystem because they don't have the checks and balances, not because they are inherently horrible species or they have no value, right? So, and I think we can say that. You know, it doesn't mean I don't want to take it out, but I might take it home and put it in a vase and enjoy it until it finally, you know, falls over after I rip the roots out. And I commonly do that. I mean, for sure, I am making garlic mustard pesto every spring, and there's Dame's rockets in all my vases, and I'm still working to remove them very actively. So I don't find those to be contrary, and I think that's fine to share. And so I don't know if that helps at all, but our Hmong are very active users of our forests, and they certainly use some of our non-native species.
Yeah, I love that because I think the importance of like, yeah, what is value and what is valuable, right? And especially if those species are familiar, right? And like you're seeing that and people are tearing it out of the ground, right? I think that is super important, right? Because the kind of conversations often like, this is a trash species or this is a horrible weed or something like that, right? Can create that kind of like negative dynamic, right? So having that, building that conversation around like, this is just we maybe don't need it in this particular location, but yeah, you could potentially take that home. I think that's a super important thing. So right, thinking about that kind of like value conversation, right, can be a really useful entry point too. So I appreciate that, Angie.
And these are very great points. I just want to remind everyone that every land owning agency has different rules. So for the National Park Service, please do not remove anything from a park and take it home, native or invasive. We have some rules about protecting all resources, not just natural, but also cultural and archaeological resources. In my university, we also collected garlic mustard from our land, and we were allowed to do it and made tabbouleh out of it. So it was fantastic. But for National Park Service, please leave it there.
I met someone once who makes garlic mustard kimchi, like her mom did. I think they were a Korean family, and she would use the garlic mustard during certain times of year. So on private land, as you're taking it out of your yard, I think maybe Angie recommended that sort of at-home stewardship, which we love at Rock Creek. Many options for great recipes, as well as good, interesting new common names. I'm realizing that we have a lot of versions of the same question in this, just in different words. And so I think we've addressed most of the questions. You all have been incredibly expansive and thoughtful in your discussion tonight, which I'm really incredibly grateful for. Alex, I'm going to pass back to you to close things out, and then maybe we'll just see if Brian, before I say this about Brian, I just want to recognize the amazingly great Anna Chukine has joined us after the conversation started. For those of you who don't know, Anna Chukine is the park botanist in Rock Creek, and we are so grateful for all the work that she does to manage the vegetation, including all the invasives in Rock Creek. So I just wanted to say hi to you, Anna. It's like having a rock star amongst our midst.
Hi, Jeannie. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the discussion. We're all ears, and I enjoyed listening to everything that was discussed. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Alex, also for moderating, and to the speakers for the answers.
Fantastic. And I'm just gonna once again extend my thanks as well. And I want to thank the panelists, but also thank everyone who participated and shared their questions. And thank you for, like we ask, pausing, listening, reflecting, and really keeping this a safe space to have these discussions. These are not always easy topics, but I'm grateful that we're able to dive into it. These are difficult conversations that we must have. And as Angie has mentioned, some of these most difficult tasks, right, we kind of put off until we can check off something easier, because it's easy to check off something easy of our to-do list, but it's important that we dive into these discussions. So thank you all, and thank you Rock Creek Conservancy and Rock Creek Park for allowing us to have this space. So thank you.
Angie or Katrina, any last words of wisdom or advice for us?
Well, thank you both, like all, so much for having me. And I just really appreciate the fact that you are, willing to kind of do this work, think through this work. And I guess I just really encourage all of you to kind of like think through, chat with each other while you're kind of out there in the kind of field doing your work, and always talking about the fact that one thing I think that we often will forget in when we're doing kind of conservation work is that we're doing this because we value, right, things, right? We're conserving this land, we're conserving these species because we value something. I think that conversation often, right, gets lost and left behind. And so there's so many kind of like ethical dynamics there. And so thinking about those values, like what do we love? What do we care about? And that definitely comes into play, right? In these conversations around like natives and invasive species, right? So think about what you value, right, when you're out there doing that work.
Yeah, and thanks for having me. This has been really great, and creating the space in order to have a safe conversation is always helpful. But a bit like Katrina, like I think it is really wonderful if we can take back with some hope and agency how we can make change and reflect on the conversations. And we don't have to agree with everything now, right? So sometimes it's reflection, and we may never get to a point of agreement. But if we can at least understand where other people are coming from, and why some change may be needed, and how we can help be part of a solution, even if it's a small step. It's a step that we can take collectively to make meaningful change. And so I think, remember, like we each have the power to interact with the world in a way that offers hope and agencies to others, and we can be inspirational to others even with our small acts of kindness and grace and understanding and reflection. And so just building that culture as a resilient community, I think, has a great deal to then offer us towards creating resilient ecosystems. So again, thanks for having everybody. It's been wonderful.
That was lovely. Thank you, Angie. And thank you, Alex, for your amazing facilitation. I just want to toss to Brian to see if he wants to close us out here, take us home.
Sure. I'll be brief. Thank you very much. This was it was at the end of a long day. This was actually a very interesting and inspiring conversation. Two things. Kathy Sykes mentioned this stuff isn't simple in the chat, and it never is. Be you talking about humans or plants or worms that have multiple different names. Some of which were never named previously, now multiple different names. I think that's important. Angela, the colleague of yours who, stated that the work that you were doing and representing for her is important, but that she didn't have the bandwidth to do it. I think any number of us in any number of endeavors who advocate for positive change and positive outcomes, reach a point where we just don't have the ability to do that. And for her to be able to say to you, you're doing the right thing, keep moving forward, makes you comfortable, at least more comfortable in that space. And it also gives her license to say that I feel like I know where this conversation is going and I don't need to check in on it on a regular basis. I know that's hard. That is hard. And at the same time, folks got to be able to go home and go to sleep, and not have to worry about all these things all the time. So I appreciate your expertise. I appreciate your thoughtfulness around these discussions. And Jeannie, as always, Rock Creek Conservancy, bring in the funk. It's a great night. And like I said, I had a long day and I was really tired. I leave this conversation much more energized. Thank you all very much.
Right back at you, Brian. It is a delight to partner with such an open-minded park superintendent and the amazing team that you have that gets all this great forest protection done on a daily basis. We will be back May the 1st for May Day. Send up your alarms for a really great conversation with the Friends of Pierce Mill about the Beckett project. So learning about the folks who actually did the hard and unpaid labor to build the place Brian sits during the day, right? Or something adjacent to that. We will learn on May the 1st. It was related to the estate, related to Pierce Mill. Please do read the website. I am also energized, but still a little tired at the end of this long day. So all the details are there. We hope some of you will join us. Thank you, Angie and Katrina, for being with us tonight. Katrina let her class out early to come to this, so you're welcome to the students of Northern Arizona University. And thank you for that small sacrifice. And Alex, thanks again for moderating. Hope everyone has a great night. Go see some beautiful spring ephemerals carefully from a trail this weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.